all such discussion of thinking outside of the box, but follow the example of the matrix and say there is no box. Only the box we create ourselves. There is no box that separates us producers from consumers. There is no box that forces us in own modes of thinking. There is no box that isolates the academy from the commercial space. Those are the boxes we're trying to break down this weekend, and we're hoping that we'll be able to engage in a dialogue together. Often when we hear from industry people, we hear concerns about losing control, and this is a conversation we had in Austin rather a lot. The clients are worried that they're going to lose control in the new media landscape. I think the opening clip illustrates the fact that you've already lost control, right? That we can take your media and do with it whatever we want. We can create our own media. We can insert ourselves into it. We could even, if we wanted to, replace Keanu Reeves with a real actor. You know, we can redefine the media as we understand it. Consumers are already doing that. So the challenge is not about giving up control. It's about accepting a new relationship with consumers, one that requires a negotiated relationship, one that means building new sort of moral ecologies, new dialogues with consumers. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, that we're here to explore together what this new space will look like and to build on some ideas that are emerging from the research we've been doing in convergence culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad to see you all here. It's taken a minute, but it's lovely. We're just going to do a quick scroll through some of the things that we looked at this first year and kind of an amp up for what's coming after that. Our big stories, well, I don't know, here's an anecdote. Someone had heard about our little consortium and called me up. The guy who's running the entertainment segment of a big media company. And he said to me, you know, those Super Bowl ads, they still work. And I said, well, thank God, because if they didn't, you'd be in a hell of a lot of trouble. Right now, it's an ideal time to be able to work without boundaries. We can afford to experiment. We can afford to test out what can happen, see what some of the limits are, get some feedback, get some information, some of it ethnographic, some of it database, just the different ways and means in which we're working, and see, okay, so how are we going to make this new world? So Web 2.2, 2.0, ubiquitous computing, virtual worlds, mobile social networks, these are all things that we're looking at and studying as a group, as a partnership, because these are the stories that are important at the moment.
So we're bringing together today leading academics from literally around the world who are thinking about these questions with some of the smartest people we've met in the media industries for a conversation. Now, I don't imagine this first conversation we're all going to say the right things or use the right language. The academics are working hard to speak common English. It's a second language for many of us, but we're working at it. At the same time, we hope corporate people will meet us halfway and will, if there are things you don't understand, ask. You know, if there are questions you don't get, raise them. I'm still struggling with how to speak business English myself. I haven't quite figured out whether a chief knowledge officer is a higher rank than a chief wisdom officer or a lower rank. It's sort of a complicated terrain of the language of modern business, but I'm hoping that we can try to find a common vocabulary this week. It's a chance for us to introduce to each other the key players on both sides of this sort of relationship that we're building together, and get to know each other a little better. So we hope it'll be informal, dialogic, conversational. Those mean the same thing. One's the academic version, the other's the business version, conversational. And we hope that we can learn from each other.
And form guilds. So we're going to be guild building in the back during the lunch break.
Okay. So as many of you know, part of what led me to be interested in creating this was that I'd written this book that's coming out this summer. This is my shameless plug moment, Convergence, Culture, Where Old and New Media Collides. And tied to that, the book Fans, Bloggers, and Gamers. So this is going to be part of a larger conversation. Ironically enough, I just was asked to be on the editorial board of a journal called Convergence, so which has been going on for some time. So convergence as a category is beginning to build more buzz. There's more discussion about it. But I think what we mean by convergence in our discussion has been sort of thinking about the new relationships that between consumers, producers, brands, and entertainment content. That is, convergence is not a technological process for us, it's a cultural process. It's a set of shifts in the way our culture operates. When we may not live in a world where the technologies speak easily to each other. We may not live in a world where there's a single black box that controls the flow of media. We do live in a world where every story, every idea, every brand, every relationship is going to play itself out across the broadest possible number of media. And that's the world of convergence culture as we're talking about it in the context at MIT.
Okay, so the white papers that you have all read, what we've been looking at, entertainment as marketing, so the implicit contract, the trust in the multiple levels of, from both the tech and the style of how a brand works and how product placement works. Alec is in the back and Grant McCracken is in the back. We can blame these two. So take your questions to them. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
Fanning the audience's flames, both Henry and Sam Ford, who's around here someplace. Sam did the primary research on this. What does it mean to cultivate the space for the consumer to become participant and maker? Consumer, as several people in this room have theorized, this is a dead word, so I'm just using it as a requiem, but, well, we're still translating. So here we're looking at that. And in-game advertising. Ilya is the researcher on this paper, and fundamentally we have to understand the worlds that we're working in. And if you're working in a virtual world, an MMO, or a console game, you have to understand the context in which you're working to be able to make your brand work or advertising work in there. So those are thumbnails of very deep and interesting papers.
Okay. This term, we've begun work on some ambitious new projects, which we hope to deliver as we get into the summer. The first we're going to reference today is an ongoing ethnography that we're doing inside dorms here at MIT, understanding young people's relationship with media, the referral economy, the way taste gets shaped, the way social consumption of media takes place, and that's being mirrored for us by our friends at GSDM, working with folks at the University of Texas at Austin. We are also in the process of collecting a large data set of response of people across the country, of college students, along similar questions. So we'll be able to compare, at the end of this first phase, some qualitative research in 2 locations with some larger scale statistical analysis being performed by some of our friends at Sloan who are very much part of this team. Alec Austin this term is working with us on a paper called Promotion versus Prohibition, File Sharing, Digital Rights Management, and New Digital Marketplace. And it's really looking at new business models, new relations between media producers and consumers. We're going to be looking at alternative reality games, and Ivan Asquith, who was introduced the session, is doing a paper for us. This is not an advertisement, understanding the use of alternative reality games in consumer engagement. And this is a growing trend in the industry. More and more alternative reality games are emerging. Most famously, I Love Bees, but a variety of others. And it's a model that I think we all need to understand better because it does seem to mobilize the collective intelligence of fans and consumers in interesting ways. Ilya will be working with us this term on emerging advertising technologies and models. As some of you know his blog. He's been pulling together over a long period of time really interesting stuff about cutting edge approaches to advertising, and this will sort of grow out of that research. And finally, moving stories, mobile media, IPT, and new models for digital storytelling. And that's the work that Jeffrey Long, who is here, is working on this term, trying to think about new modes of entertainment, the so-called mobisodes, new systems of distribution of video content. So all of the people involved in those papers are around for the conference. We hope as we get breaks and conversations, some of these issues will come up. We'd encourage you to grab people and talk to them, share your interest in those papers, any insights, connections you might have that would be relevant to the people working on those projects. We began with the spoon sequence from The Matrix. We're going to end our section with a second clip from the same film.
You're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
Message of C3 is that we don't need to fear that world, we need to understand it. We need to build it together so that we preserve the meaningful economic and cultural relationships that allow the entertainment economy to operate, that we get consumers what they want, we get brands and media producers what they want, but we renegotiate the rules. And what happens next is up to us. So that said, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, William Uricchio, who will talk some about media change. If someone could switch over to PowerPoint, that would be terrific. Oh, no, I know how to do it. Okay, with luck, the audio is working. Good. I'd just like to take advantage of the fact that we're in a museum to talk a little bit about technology and history, to talk about the two cultures that Henry referred to, a notion that there are things in the world that shape us in certain ways, but there are also things that people do that transform those things. There's a synergy, there's an interaction, and I guess the bottom line of what I'll be talking about is the way in which we can think about technologies as certainly disruptive. We've all heard about disruptive technologies, but in fact that there are ways that there are disruptive uses of technology. And that's really one of the key sites of, that's where innovation comes from. That's where repurposing comes from. And I'd like to just begin with a kind of a historiographic reference. One of the great problems with history, and you would think that professional historians have sorted this out by now, but there seems still to be some confusion with a number of my esteemed colleagues in that discipline, because we all know that, I mean, we tend to have a lot of slippage in our language. And this is not just the English language, but it's also so in German and Italian. We think of history as what happened in the past. But we know that history is the stories we tell about what happened in the past. And those two don't meet. What happened in the past, I mean, what's happening in this room now, there's an infinite number of things, there's an infinite number of points of view. There's no one correct way to represent it. But historians seem often to confuse, and their critics, of course, to confuse that and to think that somehow the inadequacies with historical modeling is that they've missed something in the past or they've deformed something in the past. That's inevitable. And I guess our language doesn't do us any favors by kind of suggesting that both of those are history. It sort of confuses the issue a bit. And I guess what I'd like to stress by the green quote there, that every age asks its own questions of the past, is that one of the marvels to me of history is to look back at different versions of how history has been told, because while that tells us something about the French Revolution or the invention of the printing press or whatever, what it really tells us about is the moment in which that historical argument was made. So, for example, in our present, and I would say maybe for the last 20 years or so, the rise of, in academic parlance, something like poststructuralism, which is all about the end of certainty and the end of the master narrative and this kind of highly self-reflexive and self-referential notions of history, which a lot of people have problems with. What do you mean there's no facticity to the past? That's really about a moment in which we have technologies like hypertext. A moment that we now would maybe talk about more in terms of Web 2.0, where we have different points of view, we have different people collaborating and participating, we have a multi-voiced narrative, a collaborative or a collective narrative. Sure, there's no certainty there. It's far more of a dynamic process. But because that's the technological and cultural moment we inhabit, one of the things that's been happening is when we go back and model our history of the French Revolution,
we're suddenly asking new questions. We're asking questions that are informed by that kind of polyvocal or polysemic present that we inhabit. So it makes older historical models seem a bit old-fashioned, at least to cutting-edge people, and it makes current history look a little bit dodgy to people that prefer their history more traditional. So I just say all of this to frame my comments today because they're coming. What I'd like to do is just use some of the questions that are coming up, some of the conditions that are in our present, Web 2.0 for shorthand, but a much bigger array of conditions, and to revisit some moments in the media past, moments that have certain historical narratives around them, but we're seeing that those narratives are now changing. We're asking new questions of the past, and what do you know? We're finding out things about the past that actually speak to our present. So rather than thinking that there's some profound rupture between now and then, between the old stuff of the past and the new world we're bravely marching into, I guess what I'd like to suggest in the next few minutes is that there are an enormous number of lessons to be learned from the past if we change the questions we put to the past. One of the things we see in our present is the problem of identity. I mean, this is an object that I guess a lot of us would maybe call it a cell phone, but we're seeing increasing ambiguity about what precisely this object is. And when you look at marketing campaigns, the States is probably not the best example for this, but in Asia or in Europe, where phone technology is a notch or two up the evolutionary ladder, are these game platforms? Are these location devices? Are these communication devices primarily? Are these, I mean, there's any number of these music downloading platforms. What precisely is this object? And it's interesting to watch. Is this a platform to watch television on? I mean, right now in Holland, Vodafone has tried to sort of target its advertising to all of those different visions of this object. And it depends what ads you're seeing or what journals you're reading, what this thing might be called or how it might be, what its promises are. So that moment of instability in a technology is actually kind of old. And so one way to sort of go back and look at the past would be to take a medium that we think we understand pretty well. For example, we could go back and look at photography. Now, for those of us who have been on the older side and who have made the switch from sort of analog celluloid-based photography, photochemical-based photography to digital, probably we still think of photographs as a way to make something and potentially to make copies of it. And it's about a way to hold the past, but also to sort of replicate the past. But if we go back to the birth of photography, actually there was a very interesting mixed message, much like there is today with the cell phone, a very interesting mixed message about what this medium was. The French, and Daguerre was probably the most exemplary of this, and his name, of course, stuck to this technology, the daguerreotype, understood photography as a way to make very precise recordings of the world, very precise copies of the world, but not copies of that copy. Daguerreotypes are unique. They were like a painting. There's only one. You don't make three of the same thing, you make one. So there was an idea of the singularity was taken for granted because that's how painting worked. Here the idea was precision of some sort of recording of the outside world. A lot of other lessons with the daguerreotype, by the way. We're going to see in a minute his competitor Fox Talbot in Britain. But the French government bought the patent from Daguerre and made it available to the world with the idea of branding photography as a French invention. So there's a little side message there that's kind of interesting. But here I really want to focus on the ambivalence of what this medium was. Were you to cross over into Britain, the British contender for the inventor of the medium, of one of the British contenders, is a guy named Fox Talbot who did marvelous work. But his whole fixation was on coming up with a negative-based process so that you could copy and reproduce, so that multiplicity was the advantage to painting. For Daguerre, this was a more precise painting, a painting that no painter could get that precise. For Fox Talbot, this was about being able to take an image and reproduce it endlessly. Two totally different notions of the same medium, in contestation for a while. So I just, look at our use of the cell phone today and think back to the roots of photography. Today, this is not an issue we think about. We know what photography is. Or do we? Because now, at least for a younger generation, photography isn't, sure it's about capturing a moment and sure it's about making copies, but increasingly it seems to be about building a network, about finding friends through shared experience, about linking your images with people that you may not know, but who you will get to know if you inhabit these kinds of spaces. So there seems to be sort of a third life for this medium, and I don't think any of us feel as though the medium has been challenged in any fundamental way, but I think if you watch this sort of slippery repositioning of the medium, it's actually kind of interesting. Now, all three of these examples for photography are kind of technology-based, obviously with some visions from people and some interpretations from people. I'd like to focus a little more on this notion of the disruptive uses of technology. And, Napster is a great example of that. No one really imagined when they were building the internet or when they were developing different algorithms or compression algorithms or protocols that some kid was going to come up with this strategy to subvert the music industry as we know it. I mean, that was never in the plan. And we all know that no matter how technologically rigorous we try to be about developing new encryption technologies or whatever, there's always some clever 11-year-old boy out there who's going to crack it. So what I'd like to do is just take this notion of disruption and move it away from the kind of RIA nightmare notion of user creativity and actually show how creativity, just point to a few quick examples of how user appropriation, how disruptive use has wound up in the things that we really take for granted today. There's lessons, there's a lot of divergent lessons here, and I'm just going to pop through a couple of them. But one of them has to do with the book. And the book is a really interesting technology, and clearly one that, I think with one could rightly say really helped our civilization to move in ways that it has. I don't want to be a technological determinist, but it's clear that the book had a lot to do with our ability to accumulate knowledge and fix it. And there's a historian, Elizabeth Eisenstein, very prominent historian of the book, who's argued extensively and in very robust terms that the book had three primary traits that really changed the world. One of them was standardization, one was dissemination, and one was fixity. Standardization. One of the great advantages the book had, argues Eisenstein, over the old script days, the manuscript days, was that you didn't have to worry about a sleepy copyist who might forget a word or forget a line or misspell something. Every book looks the same. As long as it's coming from the same printed set of typeface, you're going to get pretty much the same. Not pretty much. You're going to have precisely the same material. And what that means is that if you disseminate it, her second point, suddenly astronomers in Denmark and in Italy and in Britain can compare their data with no chance of error from a sloppy script writer, and because of the precious nature of the handwritten script, these can multiply and easily be disseminated. So that's what will advance the cause of science. Fixity, that these things are permanent, they wind up in libraries. There are enough of them that they survive the test of time, unlike manuscripts, which can, because there's so few of them, can really disappear from human consciousness. Well, that's a pretty reasonable argument, and I think most academics, certainly my generation, grew up understanding that that was the case. In fact, until recently, we never really looked for evidence of a different practice. And the different practice I want to point to totally subverts Eisenstein's argument. If we go back to the first, say, 50 to 100 years of the book, what we see is that piracy was rampant. Books were precious. People weren't exactly sure in some cases how it worked, and they would get plates. This is Galileo's Sidurus Nuncius, which is a really, sort of a key work in terms of understanding the surface of the moon, a mapping of it from his little geographic position in the world. And as Eisenstein said, this was widely distributed. Astronomers in Denmark and Britain could sort of compare the data and see if they agreed, and you could start to sort of sharpen up our empirical sense of the world. The only problem was this thing was heavily pirated, and the pirates weren't really careful about how they printed the plates. So that in fact, rampant piracy for something like the first 50 to 80 years of the book's existence didn't standardize knowledge. It introduced more noise than ever. Because at least the manuscripts were limited in number, you had to be pretty privileged to get them, so you could more or less be sure of its provenance. In the case of the book, people did claim that this was Galileo's book, even though they ripped off the plates. And you could just, the top row across is Galileo's, it's not a convincing graphic perhaps, but I think you can see that if you look at the second moon on the left, you can see that they flipped the plate, and the dimple, the crater, is now at the tough. Well, can you imagine being an astronomer trying to figure out what the hell Galileo looked at? Because it's in a very dramatically different place. Because these plates were circulated over 60, 70 years, you can also see that the plates start to wear it down, and that the detail that Galileo so painstakingly put into his drawings of the moon fade away and turn into sort of almost caricature. So while distributed, knowledge was hardly fixed, and it was certainly not standardized. So something like the book introduces the problem of piracy, which I don't think a lot of folks have really thought about. We think that this is a problem of the digital era, and it's not. So what we see here is that the solution, one of the solutions that came up, and I use branding in a very loose term here, but the imprimatur there, where it's actually assigned, this is not a numbered edition, but it's signed off, attests to the press that made it, the responsibility of the press to guarantee that this is a correct version. So it's a little bit, I mean, like we think, Louis Vuitton would like to think that that little brand on the bag makes sure it's his, and unfortunately it doesn't exactly. But anyway, you can see where that endeavor begins, to sort of fix the quality, to establish the veracity of a particular printed work. So, one of many different examples. Creative repurposing is maybe more dramatic. These may be stories that you've heard, but these are such dramatic examples, I just want to mention them. These are everyday objects now in a state of radical transformation. Objects, we just were having a chat before the thing began here about how these in many cases don't even exist anymore, as least as they once did. But still, there's an interesting story behind all of these. And the one word behind the three technologies I'm going to show you is disability. The three technologies I'm about to show you were born from an attempt to address the absence of certain senses. So people that lack hearing, for example, or people that lack vision, required ways to get about in the world. The typewriter was actually invented when the ideas first generated and when the technology sort of evolved. This is maybe the end of the 18th century, throughout the 19th century, pretty much until Remington and companies like that fix on a different model. So really for about 100 years, the typewriter is imagined as a way for the blind to write. Because, blind people want to write too. And I don't know, when I go to movies a lot and take notes, when I try to decipher my scrawl in the dark, it's pretty hard. And I guess blind people don't even have the ability to go back and correct what they've written so they can fine-tune that writing in the dark process. This was understood as a way that it would be a simple, touch-trained system that would enable the blind to communicate in writing. Well, that's not at all how we think about it. I mean, we think about it in a very different way. It's a device that's had lots of other sort of social implications. It really helped the gender situation for a short time. It allowed women to enter the workspace. Little did they know they'd be relegated to the secretarial ranks. But at least for a while, when handwriting was seen as a sort of real strong mark of character, and men had bold handwriting and women had this sort of round, flowery handwriting, this was an instrument of gender neutrality. And so there's a long and interesting history to the typewriter. But the simple point is, it got to where it is to, well, when it last existed. Do any of you have typewriters? At least one. Okay. Yeah, right. Through a very creative repurposing and obviously a market that was significant enough to support that. Telephone is another one. Alexander Graham Bell's wife was deaf. He had a very wealthy father-in-law. His experiments were understandably supported by his father-in-law, and they had a special attraction to, try to help his wife and other deaf people communicate better. The phone is nothing more than the transformation of acoustical sound waves into vibrations, physical vibrations. And this was originally designed as a technology that could let deaf people communicate over space because they could feel the vibration and ultimately could learn to read the vibration. Again, not at all how we used it. One of the crazier side stories of the phone was that Watson, the famous quote, "Watson, come here, I want you," the first words uttered on the phone. Watson spent the next 2 years listening to static on the telephone because they had the idea that the static was somehow picking up the ether, and, well, where does the spirit go after it leaves the body? It's in the ether. So, maybe you could hear the voices of the dead by listening carefully. And we have a long history of that, poltergeist on up. I mean, that's a long and different story. The phonograph, Thomas Edison, idem ditto. I mean, Edison was just about deaf. The phonograph was, again, a way to turn the sound, the invisible, ephemeral sound, into a trace, into a little zigzaggy line that you could read, potentially. Well, we use machines to read it today. But again, this was a device imagined as solving the problem of the deaf by translating one sensory input into another. So these are all sort of interesting examples, I think, of ways in which the envisioned notion of a technology was turned on its head by users who had something else in mind. Just a little side note, the telephone had a very interesting life in Hungary, and it's sort of an odd life. This was the fellow, Tudor Puskas, but my Hungarian probably said it totally wrong, was a Edison licensee in Central Europe. And the guy who developed phone exchanges, and that was his sort of contribution to humanity. And he did a lot of things. He was a gold investor in the American West. I mean, he's a very interesting character. But one of the things he started back in 1822, and it lasted into the mid-30s, was a telephone system that in fact functioned as radio. And what you're looking at here are the programming of the telephone. So in one case, you have a concert that's being played over the phone. You had a number to dial up and a time of day to do it, and if you picked up the phone, you could hear a concert. Or if you dialed up an hour later, you could hear the news, or you could hear a drama. And this thing lasts for 50 years. I mean, it's a really interesting device. It lasts into the radio era. So another maybe crazy example, but one that shows that people and cultures can really repurpose these technologies. Why repurpose them? They purpose them in ways that suit their needs. I want to just give a slightly more extended look at the technology that I do a lot of work on, and that's television, or the early history of television. I'm going to try to argue to you that television is a medium that preceded the film medium. It's older than movies. And moreover, what I'd like to do is just point to the instability, a little bit like the cell phone, the instability of the concept of television. We, up until maybe 10 or 12 years ago, thought we knew what television was. It's a box in the living room or bedroom that we turn on and programming comes in. And it started to wiggle a little bit thanks to cable and video recorder, remote control. And obviously today it's in a profound and very rapid sense of change. What I want to suggest, though, is that the changes that we're seeing today were already imagined, anticipated, and articulated a good 100, 150 years ago. And that the medium is only kind of recovering its senses after about a 50-year period in which governments and electronics industries worked very hard to fix and stabilize that medium. Could have gone a lot of ways, but that's not in the interests of the electronics sector, at least in the period right after the Second World War, and certainly not in the interests of governments who were interested in stable information environments. So I begin here with St. Clair of Assisi, the patron saint of television. Argued by some, at least by the Vatican, as being the real inventor of television. Her visions somehow had a televisual quality. I'm not sure what they looked like in the 17th century, 16th century, but there you go. And what you see here are some of the various names that were used for television. It wasn't quite always called television before the Second World War. But it had a variety of names, and you can sort of see there already that this was about bundling together existing technologies, the telephone, the telescope, the camera obscura. This is one of the it's a highly circulated image, but it's an interesting one. It's by, it was published in the British satire magazine Punch. So pretty, relatively broad circulation journal back in 1878. So that's 2 years after the invention of the telephone. That's 1876. So 2 years later, Punch comes up with this cartoon. And what we're seeing here is Edison's telephonoscope transmits light as well as sound. Actually, 1 year after the phone was invented, Nature, a pretty respectable science journal, had a false report that Bell was working on a new technology, a phone that you could see through. And you could go sort of have point-to-point visual access, just like you had acoustical access. This was a kind of embellishment of that idea with a fabulous flat screen. That's a nice flat screen above the hearth, positioned in the living room as it should be. And it's an older couple in England talking to their daughter in Ceylon. One of the interesting things about a lot of these late 19th century pictures is that you can see the television is helping to facilitate the project of colonization. They're frequently in Indochina or the Indian subcontinent. But This character, Albert Robida, wrote a wonderful book, Le XXe siècle, the 20th century. He's an author a bit like Jules Verne, except that he also he did his own illustrations. And he's got a big section, I have 20, 30 pages on the telephonoscope, as he called it, where he envisions a number of different scenarios for what this medium will be. And I think it's striking that in one of its earliest instantiations, what television is a totally diverse array of possibilities. So here's one beautifully titled, The Suppression of Absence, which is really about presence, which we know is we're still striving for the holodeck. We may have a way here at MIT to fund that sooner rather than later. But we know that a lot of our media strive to achieve a sense of presence. And it's, again, very nicely stated here. Again, a bit of the Indochina motif, but clearly this is the link between the television and the telephone, right? There's someone in Indochina can talk and see the folks back home in France. I just got a little excursus here, but that telephone idea has been one of the most persistent visions of television, and a highly contested one, usually in this sort of way, where people understand that, this isn't telephone, is it? But this is about surveillance, sorry, and this is another surveillance one. This notion of that somehow there's too much information that comes with the phone link up, or that the ubiquitous television could be a problem. There's a huge array of these kinds of, in fact, this was an advertisement this was used in an ad campaign for the televisor company, which makes you wonder how they were trying to sell this early, John Logie Baird's television. This idea that maybe too much information is not a good thing, that the beauty of the telephone might in fact be its low levels of only acoustical information. Back to Robida, another wonderful example he gives us is a little story where he says, look, here we are, 1883, you want to go to the opera, be entertained. Think about it. You gotta get dressed up. It's cold and wet weather. It's, 2/3 of the year in Paris. So you got to bundle up, hire a coach, get to the opera, fight your way in, check your coats, get up to your box. And if it's a good 19th century opera house, you're looking at other boxes in the audience. You're not looking at the stage. With the telephonoscope, he has another image which I don't have here. I thought it was animated. With the telephonoscope, you can sit in your bedroom, feet up on the chair, and watch the stage as if it's close up right in front of you. So, I mean, that notion that we're accustomed to, home entertainment. Another vision that he has is the kind of voyeuristic application, and we know that computers have kind of taken this over. Regulation kept voyeurism at bay in television for a long time, but we know if we look at the kind of predominant use patterns of computers that a certain voyeuristic application is quite strong. The news, this is the Le Journal Telephonoscopique. Again, flat screen, a way to plug into the world that's happening outside you, and even large screen public space television. Now, this is all in 1883 that this guy has sort of come up with this huge spectrum of ways to read the medium. That gets deployed starting in 1935. And that same ambiguity, that same ambivalence about what exactly this technology is, comes to the fore in terms of Germany's just about 10-year experience with daily television starting in March 1935. Now, this is a chapter of TV's history that has been a little bit under-illuminated for lots of reasons. Germans have other things to talk about when it comes to the Second World War, and television is not one of the things that's high on their list. But the fact that this was done with RCA's technology and licensing, as was Joseph Stalin's television in the Soviet Union, that's the thing that RCA doesn't really talk about a whole lot. And once you start to pull a thread on this particular story, at least in terms of some of the electronics corporations, it's a story that gets very seamy very fast. So we're not going to go there. We're going to look a little more at how television was imagined and deployed in Germany. Again, it's just part of a way of looking at this flexibility and interpretation, and that affords the space for users to come in and, again, repurpose and push. This would have been the logo you would see on TV when there wasn't a program running. Between shows, they'd sort of put this up. Between 35 and late 44, right before Berlin collapses pretty much, 2 weeks before Berlin surrenders, I mean, they have daily public TV. Somewhere between 2 hours and 8 hours a day. The Olympics, I think, during the Olympics, they were getting about 6 hours a day of coverage. I want to talk to you about 4 different models of what television looked like. Model 1 would be the idea that it's a bit like cinema. This is something you should see with an audience. Why? Well, two constituencies in Germany really loved this idea, the propaganda ministry, because propaganda, they felt, people were less prone to argue with propaganda when there's a room full of other folks around them. So they thought it might be better for that. But the socialist part of the Nazis also thought TV for everyone until it's affordable for everyone. So they came up with this idea of building television halls. And Berlin had about, depending on the year, 28 to 38 of these things, where around 40 people would come into a room and see TV. But they also built a couple of large-scale TV. This house had about 400 seats, and this one had about 800 seats. So this is large-screen projection television. I should just, for the record, tell you, I mean, they did a lot of stuff with TV, working high-definition systems of up to 2,000 lines, outdoor advertisement-style television. They had one of those working where every pixel was a lamp. The cable was a couple of meters across. It wasn't a very wieldy system, but they tried it. Second model they thought would work, and this, of course, you can imagine the electronics industry supported this model, was the idea that television is really a radio. It's just like a radio, except it's got a kind of an extra tube that you can see. And just like the radio, Germany was heavily into this idea of a radio in every household. So, gee, here's television and a TV in every household. I mean, this fits into the notion that the Nazis were, in the first instance, not about war, but about a kind of economic recovery. And when that failed, war became the next best option. This particular narrative would support that. What you're seeing here are elements from an ad campaign that was launched to sell this idea to the public of, save up now because you can run to the store and buy a TV in a year or two. And you can even see that physically, the television on the left is almost radio-like in its format. These are not German models, but they're typical of what you would have found in Germany in terms of this kind of radio sense, this domesticated sense of television. So where the theatrical sense is about events, something you stage in a big way, sort of like, if you remember, sports TV, that you could go to the cinema and pay to see, or did people go to bars to see, because you want to do that socially. This idea was kind of soap opera. This was news. This was something that would sort of surround you as an ambient sound and image in the household. And so, mega ad campaigns, taking orders for the things. So, a familiar idea of television to us. This is the one that's stuck in a certain way. Here's a third model. Do any of you know Berlin, the Bahnhof Zoo area? Because if so, this building is, the Fernsehsprechstelle is still there. And what you can see behind it it's a movie poster on that building, and that's the Gloria Palast, which is still there. So you can locate this building. It's now, what it used to be, what it says is television speaking locale. And it was a place where you could go talk on, you could have seeing telephone. And there was a national network of this stuff that went from Hamburg in the north down to Nuremberg in the south, from Leipzig to Cologne. Berlin was the center. And what this place is today is a Beate Uhse sex place. And for those of you that have ever been in one, they've got these little booths where you can put a mark or a euro and see a movie. I mean, this little television screen. And it's just uncanny that it's sort of the same. It's in the same business so many years later. Okay, fourth model. And this was a kind of, I guess you could call it politely, telepresence or teleterror. But this was using television as a control device for remote objects. And this was a pretty heavily tested, although as far as I can tell, not deployed idea of television. Here's some test footage. And you can see from the sequence that these were like little mini televisions that they would mount in the nose of torpedoes, bombs, and rockets, connected by wire to the launch vehicle, in this case an airplane. And they could steer it as it went in to hit the ship. Now, the first time actually I saw that imagery was the first Iraq War, 12 or so years ago. But in fact, this is quite an old technology. Heat-seeking technology comes right out of this. Another example. So I guess the point I simply want to make here is, one other thing that's kind of interesting when you go back through the early days of TV is to see, well, if you're trying to figure out what kind of animal it is, I mean, is it movies, or is it radio, or is it telepresence? What exactly, is it telephone? What is it exactly? One of the curiosities is to see where it shows up in a newspaper. where does television programming, where does the program day wind up? Is it in the movie section, or is it by the radio guide, or is it in the theater section, or science section? I mean, and it moves around a bit, but this would just sort of be an example. So it's actually next to it's listed next to a movie that's about radio, voice from the ether. But then it's around all this kind of athlete's foot and beautiful breast kind of advertisement. So it seems to be sort of a kind of more marginal part of the picture. It was very heavily, the program day was advertised like crazy in Germany. Even though most people didn't in fact see TV, they saw that trace of the medium. But anyway, just to say, this also speaks to its ambivalence or its identity crisis, if you will. And it's a crisis that only gets worse when the film medium enters the world, and feels, especially in the period of late 40s, early 50s, when film in America feels threatened by the coming of commercial television to America. Then you start to see these ad campaigns that try to articulate what's the difference between our medium and their medium. And there's a ton of these sort of campaigns. But they're interesting in terms of how they're trying to locate or fix a meaning for television. Now, I want to go back just one little more step here to the very first days of film, because I told you that I showed you that television was clearly imagined by people in the 1880s and 90s. The patents for television were in place in 1884. Film, when it enters the world, is about 10, 11 years later, 1895. So, in a certain way, television was the condition that formed the horizon of expectations when movies entered the world. Movies were kind of a latecomer, and they did certain things that television could do, sort of, but they lacked a key quality of liveness, of the here and now. So if you go back and you look at how movies advertised themselves in that first decade, you start to see an interesting pattern. You see names like an Amatiograph. In German, you would say Lebende Bilder, living pictures. The Vitascope, Vita from the word for life. The Bioscope or Biograph, bios, life. There's this kind of claim when film enters the world that it's about live, and to a public who's had now a good 12 or 15 years, maybe up to 20 years of hearing about television, that claim to liveness is kind of interesting. These kind of electric in this period also had this idea of liveness. Like television they knew was something with electricity. There's a lot of fantasy pictures of what it will be, but electricity is always core. When film is marketing itself, they too embrace this language of electricity, even though film, by law in most places, had to use a hand crank. Even though they could use electric motor, because of the fear of fire, they legally were required to crank it. So to call these things electric theaters, when they're using an alcohol or a gas lamp and a hand crank, is a little bit odd. And I think as an echo of this attempt of film to position itself within, here's another, the Vitascope. And when you see the image, it's almost as if they are live on stage. The scale and they're in a frame, but otherwise the scale makes you think these are co-inhabiting a space with the audience. And this was one of the real tricks the film industry tried to use in its first decade or so, to argue that film had this presence that television was supposed to promise and deliver. Tons of cartoons like this, where the cinema effect is so real, it's there, it's as if it's now. Usually these have a subtext about the country bumpkin who doesn't quite understand, there's a class issue here, but it's also an interesting and persistent sales pitch for cinema itself. I mean, I'm sure if you remember when high-definition televisions were first marketed, they used, and even stereo television when it was first marketed, used very much this idea of things jumping out of the screen at you, football players or whatever. This is a Russian version, and again, it's the country bumpkin, it's the farmer who's a little confused. And then a British version where it's the cockneys. You can tell by the buttons on their clothes. And of course, this is the famous Lumiere anecdote we hear, right? The very first film, Screen in Paris, December 1895, that the audience fled from the theater in panic and baloney. I mean, it's a apocryphal tale, but a very revealing one and a persistent one in the film industry's ad campaigns for the first, say, 15 years or so. And I think it's all about trying to both claim a position with television, and what's interesting is one more little point on this. Film was frequently called, during the first 10 years, actualité. The French term actualité was used. And actualité is like the English word news. It has a lot of meanings, but it does mean like now and present and current. around 1905 or 6, when cinema gave up on this campaign, the term that the trade press started to use for film was no longer actualite, it was canned drama. That resignation to the storied and the old and the, okay. Now, I've talked all about technology, and that was kind of my point. I just want to wind out by pointing to the fact that everything I've said about technology, that is to say, that we can take the questions we have in the present about unstable media like cell phones or whatever, and we can in fact find those moments in the past. Piracy and our big concern with that in the present, we can find that in the past. And we can find, of course, the responses that people have, and maybe even pick up some ideas on how to solve it. One could make precisely those same arguments, and you can use the language of Web 2.0 if you're talking about the text, if you're talking about what's actually in the image. Now, that's not my point, but I do want to indicate that I don't want to just stop with technology. I want to for sure tell you that things that today we're in a culture of high IP mania. The courts keep extending it, and Disney keeps encouraging ever longer extensions as Mickey reaches the limit. And we're very concerned about what's copying and what's not copying. Well, my argument would be that the way in which Western, in fact all cultures work, is by reference, by copying and modifying and copying it. You see here some of the greatest Shakespearean actors, Keane and Garrick and Betty and I don't know who the last one is there at the moment, but and what you're seeing is the ghost scene in Hamlet, and you're seeing that there starts to become a vocabulary that people use when expressing that scene. And it's because one actor saw another, and they can pass it down generation to generation. And no one said, oh, you copied his performance. Something different happened. There started to become a domain of familiarity, of resonance, so that people understood context, so that people would understand when this was an appropriate performance or an inappropriate performance. I mean, this is where cultures acquire tradition and stability. So I guess in a world where we commodify these things and we say, oh, this is IP and it's now mine, we don't want anyone else to do it, that doesn't work. These cultures can only work if it's about building reference and context, and that does happen over the long term. Other texts, famous, the foundational texts plus the Wizard of Oz, Henry knows all about this, but I couldn't avoid, after our discussion yesterday, mentioning it. But if you look at Homer, if you look at these foundations of Western literature, the Bible, Shakespeare's various plays, what you see in every case is heavy-duty recycling of all kinds of narratives that were around in the period, that are woven together in new ways, bound up in new ways. Fixed, it's true, but that's not to say that behind them isn't a lot of other texts that are doing the same thing, a whole history of texts doing the same thing. Romeo and Juliet has, countless iterations. Quilting is another great example where you can take the language of Web 2.0 and you can go back to this, what is still today. I mean, it's an enormous hobby. It's a huge market today. It's kind of unbelievable. But it's also a long-term folk tradition. You could say the very same thing about folk music, for example, right? That folk songs are developed by communities. People collaborate, they participate, they repurpose, they modify them, they cut and they mix. Languages that we're using today to talk about, Flickr and Friendster and maybe some of the stuff that people are doing in the music world, mashups and whatever in the visual world, machinima in the game world. These are really old traditions. So my point again is that because we live in a world where these are now technologically enabled in newer ways, we can go back and see if that didn't exist earlier. And you know what? It did. And then there are a lot of lessons to be learned by delving into that. Another great example of a network hard at work, the Amish and their barn raising, where a lot of people come together and there's different skill sets. I mean, this is a great instance of participatory culture, of collaborative culture, of the values that somehow were very much part of an agrarian past, and that as we enter the commodified culture of the 20th century, we seem to lose and forget about. What we have today are technologies that are helping us to go back and rediscover that. So I want to just end with a Karl Marx quote. Seems like the right place to do it. History repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second is farce. And there's a lot of wisdom, I think, in those words. I don't mean to say that it's all been said before, that there's nothing new under the sun. Obviously, we have new affordances with our new technologies. Networking and participation participation and a sense of, especially things like collective intelligence, are in a certain sense much easier and probably we're transforming. I mean, we're really pushing those practices in whole new directions than we've ever seen before with barn raisings or making quilts or folk songs. But the elements are out there, and there are tons of lessons out there so that we don't come back as class. So that is that, and thanks. So if there's anything you want to pursue or talk about, sure. Yeah, behind, I mean, I gave you these 4 visions and of television, and behind each of them were corporate constituencies. So the film industry clearly thought, TV is maybe not a bad idea if they use our cinemas. The electronics industry wanted the radio model. There were also governmental constituencies, and there were really very strong fights between the various ministries. You know, Hitler's was a divide and rule kind of administrative structure, so he always kept these guys fighting with one another so that he didn't have to get his hands dirty. So one of the big fights was between the Post Ministry, which handled infrastructure. They did all the wiring and the hardware and all that. And the Post had traditionally been the controller of news. They controlled the news wires, the wire service. And so they were allowed one bit of programming, and that was live news. But everything else they did was like transmitting towers and cables and that sort of stuff. The propaganda ministry was charged with being in control of content. And both of these ministries, I mean, had to fight over the monthly license fee. I mean, in Europe, you pay a license fee each month for your radio and your television, and that's the financing source. So even back in those days, there was a license fee. And these 2 ministries had to fight each month over who got what share of the month's revenue. Huge cultural difference between them. The Post Ministry guys were usually 2nd or 3rd generation engineers. They'd all been to university. These were talented, smart engineers. The propaganda ministry was a new ministry invented in 1933, and these were like if you had a low number on your party badge, you were probably eminently eligible to get a job. I mean, it was party clowns. It was Bavarian buffoons. It was not a very high quality people, with the exception of some of the really quite brilliant and talented leadership. By the way, it's interesting to look at the roots of advertising, because a lot of where advertising theory comes from is in Austria and Germany around the turn of the century up until the 20s. And then when Hitler enters the scene, there's a kind of split. One community sort of leaves, and a lot of it winds up on Madison Avenue, or Lazarsfeld, and the whole public radio stuff. Those are guys who did their training in Germany and Austria. And the other group wind up on the Wilhelmstrasse doing propaganda. So they did have some bright guys in the ministry, but anyway, the ministries hated one another. And one of the great finds I came across in Germany was a document on the future of television, post-victory Nazi television. So after we win the war, what's the 20-year plan? This was commissioned by the Post Ministry, and as far as I can tell, its main ambition was to use television as the way to like annihilate the propaganda ministry. And they had, I think, a really profound insight. They said, well, look, we only control live news and infrastructure. So what we'll do is we're going to build a cable news network, you Turner folks, a cable news network 24 hours a day that's going to cover Greater Germany, so that's the sort of Austria, the annexed countries, and the occupied countries. And we're going to and they talk about it in these terms, we're going to control the rhythms of daily life. This isn't about lying or showing Adolf or any of that stuff. This is about regulating rhythms of daily life. And once we do that, propaganda is redundant. Who needs propaganda when you control the beating of the drum, the beating of the heart? And it's such, I mean, a lot of the focus of scholarship on the Nazi period goes on imagery. You know, Leni Riefenstahl's inspiring, the films that are still, I mean, the Triumph of the Will is still banned in Britain because it's viewed as just, you can't not come out of that film a Nazi, is the fear. And we focus on the visual strategies and the uplifting music and all that stuff. I think this is so much more insightful about how TV works. TV is as TVs become more mobile, Jeff, this becomes a whole lot more interesting problem. But this was it's a terrific document. So yeah, thanks. That's like having a ringer in the front row. Thank you. Very much. Right, so I would say rather than solutions, lessons. Look to the past for lessons. See how they tried to grapple with it. See what worked and what didn't, and see if there's anything that they tried that seems like we could maybe port it into the present. You know, how can we know that we're here where we are today because we've all learned pretty well from the past. I mean, none of us got where we are in life without picking up a lot of lessons, good and bad. And all I'm saying is let's just expand the framework a little bit, and rather than writing off the past as like, oh, these are we all know what the book is, you know, that's an obsolete technology or whatever. No. Let's look to those moments when these media are indeed in transition, like many of our own media forms today are very much in transition, and see, you know, for good or bad, what worked, what didn't work, how they imagined it, what they're. You can often spot problems that haven't yet surfaced that could well in the right conditions. Now, again, the danger here a little bit is that it's easy to misunderstand me as saying it all happened before and it's all going to happen again. And that's not the case. Each of these media work in different ways, have different affordances. And clearly that's the case today. There are very different things possible. But there are also enormous number of similarities. And so let's take advantage of those similarities to put new questions to the past and learn what we can from it rather than just referencing old books that don't really tell us what we need to know today. No, I'll have to think about that. But I'll say this, one of the curiosity things, one of the things that's interesting is when we look behind us historically, we tend to be able to see a pretty clear developmental path. We see the path that, you know, all these roads in the world, and we've walked one, and you can look back and say, oh, that's how I got here. But it's those other roads, those parallel, like let's say in 20 years' time when DSL is like not only obsolete, but long gone and forgotten, it's going to be one of those things that people, you know, are going to scratch their head. Wasn't there what would have been the competitive environment for broadband way back when, 20 or 30 years ago? So that's why I'm scratching my head at the moment. It's in there, but it's probably not in the current disk. And, well, I think that's a really good description of the method. I mean, what I think you need to do is kind of go back to those moments when something was happening and say, let's just look at what were the spectrum of options? How did people imagine it? How did they deploy it? What are the winners and losers and why? Rather than what we tend to do, which is sort of pick the winning one and say, oh, here's how they got successful. No, that's not the story. I mean, that's part of the story. But a whole lot of the other, that could be happenstance, it could be regulatory environment, it could be 101 things, it could just be a sort of delayed, you know, what we're seeing now with, what is it called, the Blu-ray discs. It just could be bad timing. But when you go back to that moment and look at it in all of its fullness, and the dead ends are every bit as instructive as the winning number. So I think that's a really apt description of a useful method and one that just yields so much more. When I look at how cases, you know, when I look at how they're doing like at Harvard Business School, how they set up cases sometimes. Sometimes it takes account of this stuff, but a lot of times it's more people want to know how did they do it. But boy, to me, that misses a lot of lessons. Well, Well, I mean, there are a lot of examples. You can take telephone, which was, entered the world unregulated for a while, but gets regulated relatively quickly. But I mean, there's been some good work on the Amish community's use of telephone, for example, where they have a whole different way of using it. Or you can look at any of these technologies in different cultural settings to see how people have really come up with quite different ways of purposing them. So I mean, I think that happens a lot. Regulation steps in at a certain point. I mean, there's a fellow named Brian Winston who's got this grand theory of how technologies evolve, and somewhere in the middle, like his third or fourth step, it's the law of the suppression of radical potential, and that's the moment at which regulators step in and say, and businesses, industries, because you can't just keep changing standards. It just makes consumers miserable. It makes your competition. It makes everyone miserable. So they like to fix it and hold it, and eventually you'll find sort of spin-off technologies like we're seeing now with digital video recorders or whatever, sort of repurposing television. But where publics do it, they do it all the time. They do it all the time. So the Napster story would be a great, for every technology, there are those stories. Some are a little, with television, for example, you can see where for a time, well, radio's a great one, right? Because we know that people made their own radios and they put out their own sound, and it was a two-way medium until that stabilization process took place, in which case we could buy a radio and listen to what someone else had to say. So those early days would be really interesting ones to look at. Television starts that way, except television is pretty high voltage. And the amateur movement, those that survived, quickly got out of the amateur business because it was, so in that case, there's an example of a technology that's a little bit too perilous to play around with if you don't know what you're doing. But the history of computing, I mean, in the history, you'll see in this museum, I mean, the history of computing at MIT, where model trains where kids fascinated with model trains, that's here, is it, Henry, the model train? How that morphs into the kind of stuff that we're doing today or that we count on Microsoft to provide for us. This building is a testament to that kind of stuff. So we're going to see a lot of things that people have sort of repurposed, generated. Sometimes it gets picked up, a lot of times it doesn't. Sure, thank you.